So Christian nationalism, that word kind of gets thrown around, especially in Lutheran circles.
Of course.
What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. So, in terms of Christian nationalism, I'm not wedded to the term, and that seems kind of like a dodge, but I don't think it is. I think that if we look at the term, it kind of helps see what folks are saying, though. So, what's nationalism? Obviously, there was a movement called nationalism back in the 19th century, the 1800s, where that nationalism, I certainly think that as Christians, we would have a problem with, where it's basically everything in society, whether it be local jurisdictions, whether it be families, whether it be the church, whether it be any of those units or organizations inside of that national society, needs to all serve what's best for the nation. And so that does elevate the nation kind of higher than other duties that don't always get put underneath it. I mean, that's the historical understanding of nationalism. And frankly, if you look at the record, nationalism really did squash a lot of localism. It tried to subsume the church and its energies towards national things or the good of the strength of the nation.
To be a good citizen before being a good Christian.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. But specifically of a nation. Now, we know, according to the three estates, we don't have to choose like that. Sometimes we do have to choose, right? I'm a good son. I happen to grow up a Jew, right? My family commitments would be to what? Walk in the ways of my forefathers. And yet I've heard the gospel. And so I'm going to what? I'm going to become a Christian. I choose my role as a Christian over the wishes of my family. Sometimes, of course, we have to choose. But in terms of nationalism, of basically subsuming the other two estates of the family or the home and the church underneath, hey, we really need to focus on the civil government, also bashing down localism. That was not good, period. And yet at the same time, I don't think that's how people use the term nationalism these days. In fact, they don't. I know that they don't.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we're not using it in the 19th century, where it's nationalism versus localism, or nationalism versus the family or the church, and the nation is almost deified. Rather, nationalism today is usually used as our nation before globalism. And so it's actually attacking from the other direction. And I think in a positive way.
Yeah.
I mean, most politicians today, if they talk about the global good or, globalism or, I'm a citizen of the earth, they're usually up to no good.
Yes.
I mean,
they are.
You should put your nation before other nations.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
We might not have the debt problem we have if we were to follow
exactly.
that.
Yeah. If we didn't send money to everybody else. Yeah. We should think of our nation first, because these are closer neighbors than someone in Asia or Africa or Europe, and so I do think that people who say, oh, nationalism, Christian nationalism, this is just reviving some 19th century bad political philosophy. I find that specious. I'm not impressed by it at all. Rather, I think that Christian nationalism is trying to express what I expressed earlier when we were talking about slavery. And what's the vision that I would say God has if people were actually following the gospel? You have all the nations go out, and what's what we call the Great Commission? Go out and what? Baptize and make believers of all nations. It would be wonderful for the Chinese to flourish as a Christian civilization. It's going to look different than Germany or America or Kenya, and yet that's what we should want for that nation, that greater extended family, to actually be Christian and to flourish in a way that actually accords with a lot of other non-gospel things, their history, their tradition, their wants, their their special Chineseness, so to speak.
I think as you're speaking, just real quick, I think Africa kind of gets this, because I think I could use Kenya and Ethiopia. I'll use Kenya, but if you were to go back 100 years, Kenya was basically pagan.
Yeah.
And they become very Christian, but there's a full cultural shift, and there's certain expectations, right? When they see kind of paganism coming up, to some degree, they expect some kind of civil pushback against that,
Yes.
in the different ways that it rears its head. But that makes perfect sense to someone from Kenya, to whereas someone in America, that might seem very foreign.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I think that this is an important point about the Enlightenment and how it soaks in.
Mm-hmm.
So the Enlightenment in the 1700s is definitely an intellectual movement. And as I've said, most churchmen don't accept it, and there's huge resistance to its societal implications.
Mm-hmm.
I would still say that if you go to your average person on the street and if you scratch, I don't mean if you just say, do you believe in religious liberty? Oh, yeah, I'm an American. Of course I do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start scratching, wouldn't it be nice if everybody in town went to the same church?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be great if we could all have one joint worship service?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we actually have to deal with that as Missouri Synod pastors all the time because unionism accords with actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of like adultery, and let's take fornication, intercourse before marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is not that man wants to be intimate with a woman. That's actually not the problem. It's just what? Too soon.
Yeah.
Or adultery when he's married. It's with the wrong woman,
Mm-hmm.
And so sin, as St. Augustine always talks about, is a, redirected good, or a twisted good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we see, and this gets back to like how we should look at our forefathers in the faith, how they fell into these things. There is a misdirected good in America because of pluralism. It is right that people in a town want to be united with their neighbors
Mm-hmm.
and their cousins and the kids that they play baseball with. And that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we all worship together?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a good desire.
Mm-hmm.
That was the desire of the Israelites and why they outlawed paganism.
Mm-hmm.
That was the desire of the Saxons, when they had a Lutheran church that was united. That is a fundamental desire of every human being to be united in a community. Now, I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that they're not sinful or that there is an original sin, but that is a natural thing to want to have a place, a home, a society, a town, a jurisdiction where you're united, not just on the level of citizen, but also on the level of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that if you scratch your average person, they do want that. Just like your example, the Kenyan, or anybody else around the world.
Mm-hmm.
The Enlightenment kind of paint or icing over the cake of most people, I don't think is very deep.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying you're not tied to the term, but that's kind of what Christian nationalism is getting at.
I think that is what that folks are getting at.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's specious to, number one, go to kind of, this is just a nationalism of a couple centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's another specious argument that's important to confront. And that is, you're trying to, have either the church rule the state or the state rule the church. No, there's still a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Luther, Melanchthon, all the Lutherans maintained that distinction, and they found it very, very important to do so. And yet they saw a role of the civil government in maintaining outward behavior, punishing and suppressing blasphemy, supporting by the defense, the outward defense of the church. And this gets us back to, how have most people in Christian history, New Testament Christian history, seen this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've already looked at the Old Testament with Israel, but look at wherever the gospel spreads. People still give thanks to what Constantine did.
Mm-hmm.
I see him as a hero.
Mm-hmm.
Constantine is a hero of the church.
Yes.
Was he perfect? No. Justinian was a hero of the church. Clovis, not a great guy in his personal life, but in terms of what he did, in terms of defending the church against Arianism, and later on, the Franks stopping the Moors from coming up through Spain, you look at how Christianity spread, and it was a throne and altar alliance.
Mm.
And that's something we just have to recognize and not go down the route of saying, oh, no, the government can't be involved in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure, we shouldn't mix the government's duties and the church's duties. We have very distinct duties, but that doesn't mean we can't support each other. Luther talks about this in another Psalm commentary, Psalm 101. And he talks about, yes, the devil is always trying to mix church and state together. And it's all this classic stuff that a lot of people in our synod like to quote. They don't like to quote what comes later, which when he says in terms of service, mix it all together, bake it into one cake. So there's a difference between ruling. He doesn't want the state to rule the church, and he doesn't want the church, like the Pope tries to do, rule over the civil government. But he wants them to serve each other. So how can a civil governor or prince or ruler serve the true God? Well, he can give glory to God, not just in his private life, but in his office. Now, this gets tricky in America, because now I hope I've laid out that the ideal is not pluralism. We have pluralism. That's a fact. So what does that mean? Well, I think that we have to be realistic, and we should look at examples like Nebuchadnezzar or Constantine, even better. Constantine did not say all pagans have to become Christians overnight. He actually specifically allowed toleration for pagans. Now you go a few, several decades later to Theodosius, he outlaws it. Why? Because Constantine was in a different situation. He was in a situation where people were already streaming into the church. He's supporting the church. He is wanting people to come over by their own free will. That doesn't mean he didn't have a different ideal. There was kind of a ratcheting effect, like on a zip tie. You can pull it tighter, but you can't loosen it back up. And so think of the Donatists down in North Africa. I won't get into the details, but Constantine, while he was very tolerant of the pagans, you would expect him to be even more tolerant of other Christians. And yet he wasn't, because they were actually breaking away from orthodoxy. And so that's why he and St. Augustine wanted them suppressed. Augustine himself, he wanted patience, but that was a tactic. It wasn't the ideal. He wanted them to come around, but once they were stubborn, nope, you guys need to return to the fold. And he was fine with Constantine and other emperors, bringing the the heavy artillery on those guys.
You're patient on the inward, right? Yes. As you understand, okay, you're coming out of your traditions, and you're coming out of your background. We're patient there. But we need to move towards this ideal. And then there's a point, though, where if things start to retract and go back, then you've got to use a little bit more of a firm fist.
Yeah, exactly. We see this with Luther, right? People don't want to receive in two kinds. He's very patient with them. But after it's been a couple of years, he says, we've taught, you're being stubborn. We need to do this.
Yeah, that's great pastoral advice for in the church. Right?
Oh,
absolutely. You go into a church, and no church is going to be ideal. And I would just advocate, I think we also need good pastors to go into churches that have messes and to work with those rather than just to say, okay, you guys are done, right? Yeah. But to say, okay, we're going to work in this and we're going to move and I'm going to be patient on some of these things. Yeah. But as soon as there's talks of moving in the wrong direction, you can't let that stand. You've got to say, nope, we're moving towards this and this is not the direction we're going to go.
And that's in accordance with, the virtue of prudence, right? Isn't this how we deal with our children? Again, anything that's true in the home is going to be true in civil society by definition. So you have two kids. One struggles with lying, and is 4. One is 14 and has been totally truthful entire life. And if one tells one lie in a month, who are you going to come down harder on? The same father, 2 different children. You might say, you've never lied to me ever. What is going on? And you're going to come down like a ton of bricks. And you're probably going to also want to figure out what's going on because your 14-year-old's never lied before. And then with the 4-year-old, hey, that was only one lie all month. Yeah. We're throwing you a party. You know what I mean? So yeah, you
need a little bit of the parable of the 2 sons there too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you got to be careful with that. So I think with that in place, we can look at America and say, who knows the long sweep of history that we're in the middle of? Could there be a Lutheran territorial church of Wisconsin?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe so.
Maybe in Casper, Wyoming.
Maybe in Casper, Wyoming. Yeah. Maybe so.